Today and now we're going to be talking about power. And there's nowhere else, I think, nowhere else that a talk like this could begin than with this fine gentleman here. Does anyone know who this is? This is Grumpy Cat. So Grumpy Cat began just sitting grumpily on its sofa. And then it got shared onto YouTube. And began to kind of crackle with a kind of strange sort of kind of viral energy, and got shared and got shared and got shared until it became worth $76 million. Grumpy Cat started opening up shopping malls. Grumpy Cat, you could buy Grumpy Cat Christmas cards, Grumpy Cat the game. Tabitha Bunderson, who owned Grumpy Cat, Grumpy Cat's actually only its stage name. Its real name is Tardar Sauce. She quit her job to manage Grumpy Cat full-time. So she became a mean manager, kind of taking this strange-looking cat around the world. Just a strange-looking cat, but it became a kind of global brand. I'm actually slightly bewildered that no one in this crowd knew who it was. We do have some Grumpy Cat fans maybe in the crowd. You might recognize this man a bit less. This man is called John Never Die Jacobs. John Jacobs, a few years ago, mortgaged his house to buy an entirely digital asteroid in the game Entropy Universe. About $500,000 this asteroid cost, and he kind of began to sell mining rights on the asteroid. He built a zoo on the asteroid, and then people would pay real money to go and see the very rare, entirely digital menagerie of creatures that John Never Die Jacobs gathered on his digital asteroid in his digital zoo. And then he built Club Never Die on his asteroid. And again, people would pay real money to go and party in John Jacobs' club on his digital asteroid. And he sold the whole thing and bought a much bigger house for himself a couple of years after that. Does anyone have one of these? This is my Hoover. I bought it a while ago, and it's initially quite awkward. The idea is that you let it go, and it kind of supposed to go and hoover your house by itself. And it's actually not very good. You get it out the box, and it kind of swerves into chairs, and it kind of knocks into walls. It's awkward, it's clumsy. But over time, the Hoover begins to get better. So it begins to kind of almost triumphantly soar into the open spaces. It kind of stops right next to the wall and kind of rotates and goes somewhere else. And it's because the Hoover is throwing out a kind of LiDAR field around it, and it's mapping the floor plan of your house. And as it maps a floor plan, it learns where it can't go and where it can go, of course. And then it sends all of that to China. So I was doing a BBC documentary, and we were working with Imperial College London, and we were interdicting the information coming out of this Hoover, and we realized it's not just the Hoover. There were light switches which would ping an ad tech company every time you switched them on or off. There were webcams sending the data encrypted to some hard-coded location on the internet that we couldn't tell where it was. There was television that was selling everything that you were watching in real time and sending that not just to China, in fact, actually tons of this was going to the United States. And we began to kind of realize these devices, that Hoover, there's light switches, lots of other things as well, they kind of had these two weird business models sat in there. Like partly, of course, I bought the thing, so I was wanting to watch television with it, but partly, actually, it was using me as a kind of data source, and there was an entirely different product which the device was forming and then selling on. I then tried to gather all of the data which all these different devices and all these companies had gathered about me and turn it, this is again for a BBC documentary, and turn it into a kind of weird digital version of myself. So I spent about a year exercising a European right called DSAR, Digital Subject Access Request, gathering all this data and bundling it all back and trying to work out, well, what on earth does this actually say about me? It says that I have a 23% probability of gardening. I don't garden, so I think it got that. I don't have a garden, so I think it got that one right. It sadly said I didn't have an interest in books, and having written a book, I took a bit of umbrage with that one. It put me into a somewhat insulting category called young and struggling. But overall, it kind of actually fashioned a very, very rich kind of tapestry of information about whether I might like gambling, about whether I like drinking, about how I might go out for entertainment, about where I'm likely to live. And it kind of bundled together in that stuff which was both very accurate with a ton of stuff that was very inaccurate indeed. Now, Why am I telling you all of these strange, like, kind of medley to begin? It's because I want to talk to you about power, and I think power is extremely important right now for us to consider. Like, I am willing to bet that each of you, in ways as unique as all of your lives are, have probably come across in each of your own experiences something which is a little bit like maybe Grumpy Cat, or a little bit like John Never Die Jacobs, or maybe a little bit like that Hoover. Maybe a moment like that's made you, even professions such as you have, which is all to do with cybersecurity, but even then, as close as you are to technology, as close as you are to the threats that it has, a moment that's made you stop and pause and think that something really seismic is happening across society at the moment. Like, power is in a way being like reformed. It's changing hands, it's being won, it's being fought over. Even what power is changing. Like, it's always been about power shaping society, but society's being shaped in very different ways from very different people, I think, than it was before. And that's kind of what led me to basically go on a very long, strange journey around the world, trying to rediscover what power is and where it sits. And it kind of led me all over the place. I mean, I was talking to digitally departed people in South Korea that never leave their rooms. They only live their lives online. I went on to information warfare bases. I spent time with hackers. I lived in a political technology commune. And at the end of all of that, I came back and tried to make sense of really what I saw and how I saw power to be changing on those front lines. And I wanted to share two stories with you today about that. And the first one, I think, is the most relevant to you all, and that's about criminal power. I was fascinated with this question of, is power changing hands between criminals and, of course, all the people that have tried to catch criminals and prevent what they do? I don't know why the police let me do this, but the police let me go on a cybercrime raid with them. And, in fact, embed myself with cybercrime teams across the country. So, you know, I'm quite a mild-mannered researcher. I've really had no experience of crime whatsoever. But you have to imagine I'm kind of crowbarred in the back of a unmarked police motorcade. And we're kind of winding our way through the kind of evening traffic somewhere about an hour outside of London. And it's kind of the end of the day, the pubs are filling up, the kind of parks are emptying. There's 3 cars in this motorcade. I'm kind of sat wedged between 2 very burly police sergeants. And the kind of radio is squawking next to me. And we very, very quietly pull into this kind of red brick housing estate. I'm sure you can all imagine what these estates are like. They're kind of twitching lace curtains, very, very finely cut lawns. As we pull up, the police get out the cars and they surround a house. And of course, everyone else on the estate suddenly goes out and starts washing their car. And it was called Operation Field Day. And we were there to catch a serial iCloud hacker. Now, I realized that there was only one surprising thing about Operation Field Day, only one thing which kind of set it apart and made it distinct in any way from all the other cases and all the other stories which I came across during my time with the cybercrime police. Only one thing. Not surprising was that this cybercriminal existed, of course. And I don't need to tell this audience just what a seismic shift has actually happened in where and how crime happens. Researchers like me, we pay a lot of attention to the police, the crime survey of England and Wales. It's really a kind of, I don't know if people follow it, it's considered a really kind of gold-plated survey. It's really, really helpful because rather than actually just looking at the official crime data, what it does is it goes out and asks tens of thousands of people across England and Wales, you know, have you been the victim of crime? And if so, what sort? And that captures, in ways which a lot of the other data doesn't, all the crime which doesn't get reported. And it was almost casually, a few years ago, they just added a couple of questions into this survey. They continue to tinker with it every year. They added a question which is, have you been a victim of cybercrime? And they added a question, have you been a victim of fraud, especially online fraud? And when the answers came back, they were it's totally astonishing. The amount of crime which this survey, used by the Home Office and lots of other central departments, had estimated was occurring in the UK doubled. As much crime it found was happening in a digital way as all other crime types put together. So it suddenly realized that online fraud was the most common form of crime in the country. It realized that you were more likely to have your social media accounts burgled than your house, and you were more likely to receive a virus than be the victim of all forms of violent crime put together. We thought there's been this narrative that's been happening over the last 10 years in the UK that crime has been falling, and it hasn't been falling. Actually, if you add all the digital forms of crime up with all the other forms of crime, you get right back up where you were in the 1990s. So it hasn't been falling at all, it's just been changing venue. And I think outside of this room, it has not yet been impressed upon people how much crime just occurs through computers, astonishing amounts of crime. So it was no surprise that the cybercriminal that the team for Operation Field Day were there to catch, it was no surprise that this person existed. He was just joining one of many, many, many other people that were being drawn to this kind of new form of power in a way. There was a very nerve-wracking moment when we were going to go into his house. And I genuinely remember thinking, what if he jumps through like a window? What if we have to give chase? You know, I remember thinking, like, will I have what it takes if it somehow comes down to me? And when the door opened to his house, I have never seen a less hardened criminal in my entire life. I mean, the man couldn't talk. He couldn't stand. I mean, he's weirdly actually exactly my age. He had to be helped into he went ashen white, and he had to be helped into his seat by the police officers. And that shouldn't have been, I was expecting him to be kind of led out, screaming, you haven't got anything in my copper or anything like that. It absolutely wasn't like that at all. He was helped into the police car, unbelievably nervous, shaking. And that shouldn't have been a surprise either. So after all of this finished, I got hold of a hacker friend of mine, and I asked him, I said, can you teach me how to do some cybercrime? You know, how does this actually work? And so he pulled up his computer. This came up. I'm sure someone's going to recognize this immediately. What's this? It's a ransomware control console. So it's called Stampardo. Now, I don't think anyone's used the stock image yet, but we all know what I'm talking about. Every time the BBC runs a story about cybercrime, there is a picture on that screen of a man in a hoodie sitting in the darkness typing binary code into a green screen computer. And I think that is the image most of us have in our heads of what hacking actually is. So I was fully expecting, as I was about to be taught by this hacker how to do cybercrime, we were going to do some coding. This thing comes up, and it clicks on a button. It says, hi, Carl, do you want to commit cybercrime today? And you click the button that says yes. You know, and it says, what do you want to do? And how much Bitcoin do you want people to pay? And you drop down the menu, and you click on 3. You know, this wasn't binary code. This has banner advertising at the top of it. This is advertising the next one in the series. You know, this stuff is openly being advertised on gamer forums. You know, far away from, cybercrime being something which kind of elite hackers do. An idiot can do this sort of stuff. This is point-and-click, drop-down menu cybercrime. And you point and you go through these. I mean, this is easier to use in Microsoft Word. And you finish this and you get a payload, as we've heard from other speakers already, which you can kind of just freely and easily and happily just deliver into a computer as you wish. So what I learned next, and it's no mistake that this Operation Field Day hacker was unhardened. The barriers to entry into cybercrime are unbelievably low. Unbelievably low. Very, very easy to do, to get into it. What he was doing, by the way, was he was doing industrial-level compromises of iClouds. So he was targeting, he began by targeting his wife's friends, looking for private sexual material. So, of course, an iCloud backup has every photo, every video, every message, everything on the phone. And then he began to basically run this as a service for a secret community, if you want to call it that, of British men who wanted to break into the iCloud accounts of other people. And he was doing this almost every night. It almost became a kind of obsession for him, I think. So every 2 a.m., 3 a.m., every day, he had a family. He would wake up and he would break into people's iCloud accounts, an iCloud rip, as they call it, and he'd be out of there by morning. And the way he was doing that, I can't tell you how. I'm sure some people have an idea how that could happen. But he was actually doing very sophisticated stuff as well. And that's the last thing that shouldn't have been a surprise during Operation Field Day. So After this, or after I tried my hand at least developing a ransomware file, I then went to Las Vegas. You're hanging out at Snackus Maximus. Who's been to Vegas? Have you been there for the same reason as me? You're hanging out at Snackus Maximus. You're kind of having your Caesar salad. You're in the dry Nevadan heat. And then suddenly, once a year, every year, this whole new kind of player comes into town. They've got blockchain tattoos. They've got kind of coder joke t-shirts. They're wearing black. The billboards start getting hacked down the strip. Because once a year, every year, DEF CON comes to town. The riotous, scary, really, really fun annual gathering of the world's best hackers. And so on these giant stages, glowing neon podiums in front of literally 10,000 other hackers, every year the world's best hackers will talk about the year's cleverest hacks. They are, in a sense, very dry and technical affairs, and with jet lag, I was actually nodding asleep during some of them, and suddenly you'd wake up as everyone would jump to their feet, opening bottles of beer in cheering and applause. And that's because what these members of the hacking community are demonstrating they can do is totally astonishing too. So this man stood up and said, you think your laptop is safe because it's air-gapped from the internet, nonsense, and he hacked it using light. He then hacked it using light you couldn't see. He then hacked it using sound. He then hacked it using sound you couldn't hear. He was using stenographic encoding to do this. Someone else in dull monotone stood up and said, basically proved that he could cause a reasonably large percentage of the world's wind turbines to lock and possibly burst into flames. And of course, you know, what else was the watchword in my year other than AI? So AI, we already saw AI ChatGPT being used to develop like entirely novel exploits, writing code itself. And so that was the last thing that didn't surprise me. This community of hackers, they're split on almost every major political issue you can think of. They come from all over the world. There's Nazi hackers, hippie hackers, eco hackers, Russian hackers, Ukrainian hackers. But they're united in having, I think, this kind of shared set of values to do with the technology itself. Always interested in how it works. Always wanting to pull it apart, never being happy with it being a black box, always trying to learn and develop their technical mastery. And I think that has meant that community, teaching itself as it does, has kind of leapt into the stratosphere in terms of what it actually is capable of, not to you all, but to be way beyond, I think, the kind of like the knowledge, the expectation, or the assumptions of the general public. One surprising thing, and here it is. The only surprising thing about Operation Field Day wasn't that this guy existed. It wasn't that he was very unhardened. He didn't have any kind of anything else going on in his life which would have drawn him into crime. And it wasn't that he was doing actually some very capable things which caused, you know, an enormous amount of, like, I think, pain and anguish for people ultimately when all of this came out. It was that he was caught. It was that we were there in the first place. Because in all the other investigations I sat through, time and time again, they all hit this kind of brick wall. And it wasn't actually skills. Like, the people I was with in the police were actually some great hackers in there. It wasn't technology, per se. The police had brought it in. It was geography. Because crime on the internet, like anything on the internet, passes unbelievably easily across borders. So time and again, a DDoS attack on a school, you know, a threatening email, time and time again, the police would see that the victim was in one country, the perpetrator was in another, and the evidence was sprayed all over the world. And if it was sat in a jurisdiction cooperative with us in the UK, like the United States, well then, oh, that's just a matter of an MLAT treaty in 6 months and a use case into the police. But if it sat Russia, sat in a lot of countries that will have nothing to do with us, nothing to do with law enforcement, well then, to quote a cybercrime officer, the chances of being caught are close to nil. And that's I thought I had half an hour. I started at 10:15.
No,
Did I not?
10:30 finish.
Oh, really?
– 10:15 to 10:30. We have Fortinet at 10:30. Is it? Yeah. Oh, my brief is wrong. I do apologise.
That's okay.
Carry on.
Thank you. Phew! I would have come off the stage being like, I did not time that well at all. All right, well, we've almost got to the end of this journey, and then hopefully I've got 2 more minutes to take you through something else. Geography. So, cybercrime, both the most underreported crime in the country and the least convicted, I believe, in the latest stats. And of course, the end of all of this, coming back from this, was my idea that I think we're living through one of the greatest crises of law enforcement in the history of modern policing. That we've both seen a huge transition of crime into digital areas, and then 43 police forces. I can't imagine a way of setting up the police that's worse at dealing with a crime which is ageographic than dividing our police forces up into 43 local constabularies, all of which have set up a small cybercrime team that just happens to be near the victim. Which of course makes all of your jobs even more essential. Because however scary it is to admit, increasingly it is not law enforcement that is actually dealing with this problem. It is the private sector and it is companies that have taken on that enormous amount of the burden. So being on the front lines of all of this, as you all are, I can't think of anything else. And as power, in a way, I truly think has kind of drained away from the police in actually dealing with this. Well, so the responsibility, if not the power, is falling into your hands as well. So just as someone who's not part of the cybersecurity community per se, thank you for everything you do. Thank God you do what you do. Because without that, I really don't know what kind of world we're lurching towards. But before I talk about power overall, I did want to briefly talk about this. I do have a few more minutes left, I hope. I want to talk about AI. Because so I've got a podcast series about to come out, it's not out yet, but I couldn't resist taking you through a very, very brief journey into power and AI first, because I know it's something that we're all thinking and talking about. So in the same way, I've been trying to understand, well, how is the terrain shifting right now? In these kind of early months of the post-GPT age, what does all of this actually really look like? And I wanted to move from the very smallest to the very biggest question. So power over the AI itself. What I did not realize was that the same approaches that were being used 10 years ago to train models are the ones that are being used today. The underlying thinking really hasn't changed very much. What has changed is the sheer scale of compute and data which is going into these models. And that really benefits very, very large companies. And there's a very clear expectation that the frontiers in AI, especially around large language models, are going to continue to come from one place in the world, and maybe one place only, but certainly one place primarily, that shallow basined valley in California. It's really there where these enormous companies have developed, and I think it's really there where there's now a race here in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, to see whether we can match in talent and compute power and capital the concentrations which have allowed the Anthropics and the OpenAIs and the Bings and the Googles of the world to build these models which have suddenly astonished everyone. Are we all going to get automated? The answer is probably not. Revolutions don't really work like that. You automate tasks really rather than jobs. So I think the clear answer back is that we're actually unlikely to see kind of precipitous drops in the amount of work. Very interesting is power and the global north and the global south, though. And whilst all the pipes and all the data is kind of pointing to that one place in California still, these models being as general as they are and as open as they are means that if you go to India, if you speak to people in the developing world, they are putting uses for these models that actually I couldn't have dreamed of. They're developing models to allow subsistence farmers in India to access government loans, or to translate a document training people how to access certain kinds of seed a subsidy in loads and loads of different languages. So we've got this kind of weird situation where power isn't linear. It's both concentrating in those giant companies, but also distributing in terms of access and empowerment at the same time. I'll end, though, with a question I really never thought I'd ever have to consider: AI and humanity. Who is worried, in an existential way, about AI? Yes, some brave hands. It's a legitimate worry. And it's now a practical question. And I think coming back from all this, there were two things that I learned. One is that the models as they exist are basically sophisticated autocomplete. They're so good at sounding like humans, it's tempting to think that there is some kind of intellect peering back at you from those models. And there isn't. Not in any way that we would understand intellect, not in any way we'd certainly understand sentience and consciousness, but the current pace of development is now an exponential on an exponential, as someone within one of the frontier companies described it to me. They've described the current moment we're in as like being an alchemy. Like it's like peering into the brain of an alien, one of them described it to me. They don't understand why these models are doing what they do. They can't interpret them very well, and they don't know why, loading in all the data as they've done to these models, they've suddenly leapt forwards in performance in ways which actually has surprised veteran researchers in AI. So I think the world that we're in, and I'll end this by a brief, taking this back to power actually, is one which is kind of ironically both full of data and actually deeply mysterious at the same times. It seems to me that with all of our models and all of our information and all of our networks, actually how our lives are shaped and what our futures are going to look like is actually becoming less knowable rather than more knowable. It's actually becoming kind of harder to peer into the months and years ahead, not easier. I want to end actually on power, and again, why I think what you do is very important. Because whether it was cybercrime or AI, the kind of question that I'm always set by editors or podcast producers or whoever it is are we being oppressed or liberated? You know, are we being freed, or are we tumbling into a dark world of new forms of control? And actually, that is an impossible question to answer, because every single time you try and diagnose power, I think you find an onrush of both great liberation and control happening more than before at the same time. So we're in both a moment which is actually full of new promise and opportunity, and also one of kind of real lurking threat and worry. And that is because of what has happened to power. Power has gone wild. Power sits in new hands, the hackers, cyber criminals. It sits in new forms which are weird, forms we often can't recognize. And that means that in these wild forms, power is being used by people to do the things that people have always done to each other. Be really nice and amazing and wonderful and inspiring, and also horribly mean and cruel to each other. And that's where the oppression and that's where the liberation is coming from, a more perfectly expressed form of power. And in the kind of years ahead, we have to cage power again. Like, that's what civilization always does. We always build bars around power to stop it being used in ways entirely up to the people that can have it. And those bars of the cage are the law, of course, and norms, and professional standards, and you know, Royal College of Algorithmists, and everything else that has to happen. And I would say that probably of everywhere that I've seen and everywhere that I've traveled, I can't think of a community of people that have actually more effectively put the bars on that cage than the world of cybersecurity. Because more than anything else, it is you guys that actually literally reinstall and rebound what power can be used to do. So anyway, hopefully that's a kind of contextualizing whistle-stop tour for you. Thank God I didn't run 25 minutes over time. Thanks for coming with me on my whistle-stop journey through power. Come and grab me. I'll have plenty of other stories if you want about other places I went and where and who I spoke to. But thanks for your attention, everyone. It was lovely to be here today. Bye.